Good evening. If I could kindly have your attention, I'm delighted to introduce and welcome Alison Brooks, who's teaching at Option Studio here this semester. This year marks the 22nd anniversary of Alison Brooks' practice, which Alison opened after 7 years as partner with Ron Arad and Associates, where she worked on projects such as the foyer of the Tel Aviv Opera House. I think if we measure this years as distance in one's career, I think 20-odd years would be considered to be long distance in many other professions or disciplines. But it's not often the case in architecture. We think about like Le Corbusier's 60-year career or Frank Lloyd Wright's 70-year career. But in many ways, I think Alison's trajectory is one that belongs to this long-distance mentality. As opposed to the ones whose career accelerated at the outset, I think Alison belongs to a secular sector, a group of perennial outsiders who are on the slow burn. You know, this group, they're very good, they're very serious about the work. They're not on the fast track, but pursuing their own architectural interests with a tenacity, with quirkiness and confidence, and producing quietly subversive work. While many of us, or some of us, have been following her work for a long time, I think many outside of architecture, the architectural cognoscenti, might not be aware of Alison's work until the debut of the pavilion called The Smile, designed for the London Design Festival. And those of you who've been to London in recent years, even if you have not noticed the distinguished vertical forms throughout the city, a taxi driver could tell you which one is the gherkin, which one is the shard, which one is the walkie-talkie, which one is the cheese grater, which one is the can of ham. You can practically have a picnic. But so I think in 2006 it was very refreshing to experience a more horizontal, a more ephemeral model named The Smile. The project itself is an accomplishment from a design, from a structural and material standpoint. Alison Brooks was born in Ontario, Canada. She moved to London after studying architecture at Waterloo. And over the many years, she had won many awards. She's the only UK practice to have won RIBA's 3 most prestigious architecture prizes. That includes the Sterling Prize, the Mensa Medal, and the Stephen Lawrence Prize. Alison herself was awarded the AJ Woman Architect of the Year in 2013. And after many years of honing her craft, Alison's practice is booming. You know, her work now encompasses urban design, housing, education buildings, and buildings for the arts. Although many of the projects are designed very distinctively for very specific cases and sites, I think one could trace certain tenets throughout her work. There's always a strong commitment to the public realm. There's a vast knowledge and commitment to the history of urban typologies. One could see the use and transformation of types such as mews or quads or arcades in her work. Her work often bridges between the Victorian or Georgian historical fabric of London and the brutalist work from the 1960s. She really sees her work understand her work as a process of healing or stitching this urban fabric. I think on the surface, I think Alison is a modernist architect. You know, there's clearly a sensitivity to materials, context, and scale. But I think behind that type of politeness, there's a strong rigor and insistence. Those of you who might heard her say things like she insists on designing nothing under 2.6 meters for a room height, which is like 8.5 feet. There's nothing better than a French door, so why reinvent it? You know, but what I love about this dichotomy that she has between restraint and rigor is very different from this Adolf-Lozian kind of strict division between, let's say, a reserved gentlemanly facade for this Georgian exterior with a hedonistic, luxurious interior hidden within the inside. Her work kind of deals with these two opposites by oscillating constantly between the two. So it's always an act in motion. To end my introduction, I'd like to quote one of our distinguished alumnus, John Haydock. He said, "There's a short-distance runner architect, and there's a long-distance runner architect. The short-distance runner is just that, a short-distance runner. The short-distance runner's trail is straight, flat, and the end can be seen. The short-distance runner is a crowd pleaser. The short-distance runner runs fast and is soon out of breath. The long-distance runner's scope is simply vaster. The long-distance runner traverses a more complex landscape. The long-distance runner gets better with age. The long-distance runner's distance is extended. The long-distance runner's architecture at once becomes sparser and richer." So I hope after this lecture it leaves no doubt that Alison Brooks has signed on as a long-distance runner, traversing through the long and treacherous terrain demanded of every architect. So please join me in welcoming Alison.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for inviting me to lecture, to teach. I'm really enjoying my first few weeks of teaching at the GSD. It's a real honor, and well, I hope I live up to the long-distance runner sort of accolade that you've given me, which is, I think, something that most architects hope they have. It sort of reminds me of another quotation from Corb, which is, creation is a patient search. And so we all have to be patient and keep searching. So I've called this talk Model Building Model, which is kind of unusual, making Oxford's new collegiate architecture. But I'm going to talk about more than just models. I'm going to, at first, give you a bit of a preamble as to my practice and what I've been doing for the last 21 years. Coming up to 22 in practice, and actually 30 years in London. So my office is based in London, and I range between 30 and 40 people in my practice. And here you can see a kind of funny series of maps where the UK is really huge, and a lot of my work is there, and North America is really tiny. But I have my biggest job in Vancouver at the moment, a series of towers. I've also done work in Europe, and my first project in Helgoland in the middle of the North Sea, an island, a spa hotel, which you can just about see up there on the right. Recently I've been asked to do work in Moscow and Australia and elsewhere around the world. So it's kind of nice being borderless, I think. One of the good things about being a foreigner in London is London embraces you, and I think it gives you a certain distance from the kind of class system and other things that sort of hinder the UK, but at the same time it's very much a world city, and it's completely inclusive. So this is, in a way, my mental map of London. It's a very green city, very dense, and it spreads. It sort of goes on forever, but you can very clearly see the pockets of green. And then a different kind of map where the green is black, and this is a kind of density map of London. And you can see it's generally low density. There's a kind of hot spots in red where the City of London is, and new developments in South London. But it's kind of an amazing organic European city. And without the kind of huge gestures from many monarchies, because it was parliamentary democracy very early, it doesn't have the huge sort of gestures that normally define European cities, but it has amazing qualities, such as the Garden Square, the terraced block. This is Bedford Square, for those of you who haven't been there. This is where the AA is. And Bedford Square and the AA was, in a way, the reason for me moving to London in 1988. My school was very close, sort of intellectually to the AA, and I felt a sort of familiarity when I came here. And Fitzrovia and Bloomsbury and the garden squares that define London are one of the great sort of contexts that you work within in London. And these images that obviously the Georgian terraced houses of either the AA, now they're adapted to be university buildings or doctors' offices, hotels, any number of uses, and the kind of great adaptability of that Georgian architecture is something I've learned a lot from. It's also the first minimalism. There's kind of amazing break in British architecture when it sort of departed from like the Baroque or the Renaissance tradition and went completely minimalist to suit the Georgian developers. And so that brick, stripped down brick and white window frames are very much developer architecture, but also civic architecture. And London's also got great places like Somerset House, which is one of my favorite places in London. That's a 300-year-old quadrangle that presents a very urban frontage to the Strand, and then has this incredible oasis, which is a public square, and it's actually the first example of a mixed-use urban typology anywhere in the world. Containing arts institutes, offices, Navy offices, tax office, everything under the sun. And so this context of London, here you can see Regent's Park and some of the Nash crescents. This is Regent's Park here. London's fabric, its kind of messy fabric is interrupted by fantastic green spaces. And so I'm very grateful to London because it allowed me to, in a way, start my practice and do things that I think might not have been able to do if I'd stayed in North America or in Canada. And one of the very first projects I had when I started my practice was the VXO house. And I like to show this image because it was a 1960s house of a client who'd had a fire in the house, and she called me up, and I knew her from when I worked with Ron Arad, and she said, "Could you design me a new shelf?" And that was the shelf that she, for her office, that she wanted a new design for. And it turned into this project, which is the VXO house, which was a complete renovation, extension of the house. So everything was gutted, an extension to the front, additional bedroom and foyer, and then a gym and guest house here where there was a garage before, and a carport over here. And this project, in a way, launched my practice because, well, it got an RIBA award and it was published, and I treated this project as I treat all of my domestic projects, as a kind of essay, a testing of ideas. And in a way, this was my purist, modernist experiment, where I wanted to sort of really emphasize the kind of 60s quality of the house, with sort of floating volumes and very graphic structure. Every element, even the front door, is a sort of object unto itself. There's a huge wall that's actually a wall drawing by Simon Patterson, and you walk through a door in the wall to the cloakroom. It's made of sort of autonomous pieces, and each one is expressed as an individual thing. And the idea was to create a kind of campus, so it's like a domestic campus. The house, which is the V, and then the X pavilion, which is supported with a sort of X-shaped structure, replicating the shape of a human body. And then the O port, which is a sort of impossible structure. The load comes down via an O-shaped piece of steel. So it was a kind of lighthearted project, but very serious at the same time. I made the retaining walls out of pebbles to evoke sort of grottos. The roof is held off the walls so that it reads as a tray, suspended staircase that acts as a screen. So each object had its own kind of role. But after that project, I felt I'd kind of exhausted that sort of essay, and it was time to try something new. And this was a house extension in South London, where I sort of took the opposite approach. I wanted to make the whole extension out of one element. And so this is the one element, a 3 mil thick sheet of brass. And so by a series of cuts and folds, the single sheet creates columns, sunshades, benches, facades, roof, internal wall finishes. So this was, in a way, trying to reduce architecture to its absolute minimum, just one piece, one element, and to make it kind of disappear. So I started working with mirror polished stainless steel and lots of ways to create illusions of thinness and lightness. That sort of led to another set of experiments that had to do more with sort of manipulating that planar quality. And and working in a sort of with geometry and in the spirit of sort of origami, to create a sense of movement and a dynamic quality to facades. And this is an apartment building in Accordia in Cambridge, one of the 3 building typologies I designed there. And this is a kind of early sketch, which was just an idea of how to make a kind of crystalline architecture that sort of breaks the rules of this sort of orthogonal arrangement of point blocks and becomes a kind of apparition, something very much about light and reflection. And this led to other experiments. This is a house, the Salt House in Malden, Essex. So this is a seaside house, and this was a kind of hybrid oyster fisherman's cottage, American beach house, and atrium house. And in a way, it was the first time I decided to work with a pitched roof, because I'd never, ever considered anything other than a flat roof throughout my education. And I felt that I needed to embrace the idea of roof as a form, as a sign, a signifier, and to explore its geometry. And by working with a hipped roof, it actually created, it sort of had its own logic, just by sort of working with the perimeter of the building to make the building and the whole thing a sort of bay window to capture sea views. That actually created a whole series of effects in terms of the elevations and the plans, which have this very dynamic, organic, fluid quality. As a series of internal spaces. And this idea of hybrids then migrated to my first sort of major housing scheme, which was Newhall in north of London, where I did a competition with a developer for 84 units of housing. And my ambition, my essay, was how to create suburban housing that appears as a kind of land art that feels totally tied to its place and changes the sort of economy of suburbs. And so the sort of hybridized typology combines a sort of shop front of a traditional sort of Georgian house, the geometries and forms and materials of Essex barns, the Miesian patio house, and a kind of obsession with Brancusi and his totems. And this amalgamation resulted in Newhall B, which was shortlisted for the Stirling Prize in 2013. And it's a series of housing typologies. I'm not going to show all of them, but these are courtyard, back-to-back terraced houses, all of which have workspace in the ground floor. So the idea was to transform suburban housing into workspaces where people working at home felt like they could participate in the street, even have a sign. Some people have signs on their front window. They're prefabricated timber. They have 2.6 meter high ceilings. A lot of them came without the roof adapted, and you can expand into the roof after you buy your house. So this was a kind of quite an experimental project that's been hard to replicate since, but it's something that is used actually in the UK as a kind of precedent for all suburban housing now. Then I also did constantly doing competitions. All of my work came via competitions until a couple of years ago. This was for a seaside city in the UK, Folkestone, and they staged a competition for a performing arts centre, 220-seat flat floor multi-purpose performing arts center with restaurant and cafe and offices on the top floor. And I'm making the long stories very short here, but the idea for this was to somehow draw on the iconography of Folkestone itself, the sort of seashell window surrounds, which are very typical in a lot of late Georgian architecture, and the fact that scallops are actually still fished in Folkestone. It is a fishing town. And I wanted to sort of abstract this language, this iconography, to become a sort of veil and an expressive sort of enclosure for the entire building, and also that it would glow and reflect its sort of creative culture by being a beacon for Folkestone and its creative communities. And this building also was about sort of restoring a bit of streetscape. This is a Georgian street that's gone through tough times in the past 150 years, and so there was a gap there. So this building is very much about sort of completing the streetscape and working with a kind of very expressive material that's both at the same time feels delicate and fragile, but is very robust. It's expanded metal mesh. And this is the interior, very low budget building, £3.8 million, which seems incredible in today's terms, but it's a very hardworking cultural building. And then other projects like the Lens House. This is an extension, a conversion of a Georgian house in Canterbury, in London. And again, it's a kind of project that you only have certain clients who allow you to do things like this. But it was, you can probably see a sort of iteration of the fold house, the brass house, where I was trying to work with a single sheet of material that sort of through a series of operations becomes this folded focusing space. And this project's all about this tree. Sort of all of these lenses or windows focus on this huge walnut tree. And this is the first example of corian used as a cladding. So this is anthracite through color corian, which is amazing because it doesn't age. It stays looking absolutely pristine. And you can achieve, this was my sort of pride and joy, was where all this point here, where about 8 or 9 planes all come together in one point, and there's no flashing anywhere in this building, like there's no visible flashing. So I've been sort of refining these techniques over many years of trying to achieve a kind of detailless building in a way. And then this is really a slow burn project. It's actually still happening right now. It's more than 10 years I've been working with this client in Gloucestershire. He contacted me. He and his wife had bought this Victorian farmhouse, which is here, that they wanted gutted and converted into a kind of gallery for their African art and Indian tribal art collection. And that became also an extended project, a 300 square meter house. That would be the kind of real inhabited part of the project. This is for guests. It's all for art. And then most recently, a pool courtyard where the guest room is sort of embedded in the garden wall in a very simple kind of invisible architecture. And so this project, again, there are similarities to other domestic projects where it's working with an existing structure. This is a sort of early Victorian farmhouse. We extended the back, used mirror polished stainless steel to kind of be quite playful with the idea of extending and reflecting the landscape, because planners generally in the UK, they want any new work to disappear. So you're always trying to make your architecture invisible. So here the mirror polished cladding makes that extension invisible, but on the bottom. And then this is a kind of very low-lying extension, huge extension that's embedded in the landscape at the back of the house. And this sort of simplifies these diagrams, the operation of sort of starting with was kind of a 9-square grid with a courtyard at the back, a sort of light well, and then manipulating the geometry of this to create contained spaces and views and bay windows. And then the roof plane itself, I manipulated to create a kind of landscape because it does emerge out of a sort of rolling field. And this kind of geometry in the plan, you can probably see echoes of the Salt House and some of the other projects. And again, it's an atrium house with a kitchen at the center, a kind of panopticon of views in all directions. And this is a kind of journey. The whole building and the way it connects to the landscape is a narrative. What I sort of see as a mixture of sort of capturing views and creating places for art. And so these sections sort of show how a very vertical Victorian farmhouse is, in a way, morphs into a very horizontal set of spaces with roof terraces, double height volume over the living room, very much trying to make that kind of deep connection to the landscape so you can see right through the house into the courtyard at the back and sort of manipulate in a sort of origami-like way facades so that solid and void and glazed and unglazed are blurred. And this is the house from the back. So this is the courtyard that's cut out of the landscape. Some Corten steps up to the guest room. So it's in a way tries to reflect the informality of its context and also contrast with the existing architecture. And this is the sort of conversion of the Victorian house. So I opened up triple height spaces, and it's become a sort of display for the client's collection. And then as you move through the building, you can look down through internal windows to look at his sculpture from different perspectives. I mean, these photos are empty of all of the collection there when it was finished, but every surface is really conceived as a place to display artifacts, sculpture, art, and the staircase is actually supported on this steel grillage, which is, I call a display for 100 objects because there are 100 cells in this wall, and it's also the structure for the stair, so the stair cantilevers off of that spine. And then the pool house courtyard is very subtle, very quiet, and there's just one opening that you see into, which is the guest accommodation, and the courtyard frames these incredible views to the landscape, and then there are some sort of quiet places in the entrance. So this project is, I suppose, shows exploring different aspects of, you could call them obsessions over time, sort of making homes for people where they can display their meaningful artifacts and live with them in a very easy way and also connect very directly to the landscape. And these principles I bring into my housing as well, my urban housing. I'm always trying to make every project a sort of bespoke project for whoever the client is. So at the other end of the spectrum, around the same time, I was doing competitions for housing and regeneration projects in London. So this is northwest London. This is this area called South Kilburn, which is just north of Notting Hill and Maida Vale, for any of you who know London. But I like to show this image because it shows how London was in 1938. It was a kind of expression of a complete and perfect Victorian city. The Victorians were amazing urban designers. They don't really get talked about very much, but you know, this neighborhood had huge parks. This is Paddington Recreation Ground. This is all mansion blocks in Maida Vale, terraced houses, avenues, Kilburn Park Road, all sort of shops lining the major streets, sort of interesting chevron-shaped arrangements and triangular squares with churches and terraces. I mean, it was a kind of complete neighborhood. And it was completely razed. This was the sort of master plan for this part of South Kilburn in 1952, I think it was. And so the idea was to destroy, like demolish all of the terraced houses in all of the streets and basically sprinkle slab blocks around in green space. And actually, most of this was built, but at the time, a sort of local residents association decided to fight back, and they prevented all of this from happening. And this is a conservation area, although this was built as well. So the kind of amazing, misguided approach to re-urbanization still leaves its mark, not only in London, but many cities all over the world. And this is actually an image of this part of the master plan right here. So this was supposed to be the town center. And everything is boarded up. The streets were all blocked off, and this was supposed to be a sort of plaza for residents, and there are these slab blocks replacing what were terraced streets. And I participated in a competition in, I think, 2010 to actually, the local authority, Brent Council, they sponsored, most London municipalities sponsor competitions and regeneration master plans for their estates. They're called failed estates, basically, or sink estates, and which are generally social housing. They're not a mixed community. They're kind of low-income communities, and there are a lot of problems in them due to not only sort of social and income segregation, but architectural segregation, and kind of failed urban design principles. So you can see here how the sort of slab blocks that were in that sort of 1952 master plan are still here, and then there's sort of green space, and then funny sort of low-rise blocks. And in a way it looks fine, because you think, oh, well, there's all this green space, and it's all kind of okay, but this was a really, really dangerous neighborhood here, and this I've just shown as a kind of cultural divide between the have-nots and the haves who occupy the sort of historic typologies. And so this project for Ely Court, which I'm going to talk about up here, is one of 3 projects that I've worked on in South Kilburn. All of them were competitions, all of them were collaborating with other architects. So Lifshitz Davidson did this piece up here, and I did this piece, and then we shared again on this site, and then with Field and Clegg Bradley on that site. And the local authorities really appreciate that. They don't want one architect doing everything. They don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past where you have a sort of monoculture, architectural monoculture. So my approach here was to, in a way, very straightforward, to restore the frontage to the street with a terrace block here, which is actually a mansion block. So these are duplexes with entrances every 3 flats, and a little apartment building down here, another apartment, mews houses, and then a piece here that sort of completes what we call the flat iron block. And the idea of this, well, all of these was to kind of reframe this piece of neglected space to create a public garden square where all of the buildings around sort of have a role in overseeing and sort of reactivating this piece of neglected space. And this was formerly just a place that you would never go, because if you didn't live there in one of these slab blocks, you would never go in there. So the idea of introducing a new street that connects through to the rest of the block brings people going to school, all sorts of movement in cars and traffic, which are good at a slow speed. And these are the typologies: the mansion block, the flat iron, and the mews block. And so, in a way, when you see our project here, it feels like it's not very radical. It's just kind of framing the space of the street in the way that the historic buildings have always done. But actually, this is what these sites need. They need a kind of normalization. They need a direct relationship to the street with front doors, with lots of windows, and a kind of very clearly defined public space. And so in a way, the opportunity for articulation and detail in this project, I mean, obviously it's the local authority, not huge budgets for building these projects. So the form is very simple, and all of the effort has gone into sort of articulating the common entrances for the flats above, which are up here. And these are two-story houses, duplexes that run right through from front to back. And these porches or verandas are very natural to me. Being North American, you have to have a porch on the front of a house. And then recessed balconies. So every place is sheltered, and so you create a depth, a sort of 4-meter depth to the facade that gives shade and shadow and privacy, shelter from the rain. And people actually use them as rooms, as outdoor rooms. So much more useful spaces than simple balconies. So these the porches also hide the bins, rubbish bins, which are behind those, behind the vertical elements. So this project actually was shortlisted for the Mies van der Rohe Award a couple of years ago. We lost out to NL Architects. It was their Bijlermeer project in Netherlands. But for a sort of low income, well, it's actually a mixed income project, to sort of make it that far is kind of amazing. You can't tell the difference. I'm not even going to tell you which units are affordable and which ones are private sale, because it doesn't matter. They're all designed to the same standard. So these are the Muse houses. So it's a mix, 40% social affordable housing and 60% private sale. And then this image, I think, I really enjoy, because it shows how the 1950s architecture, which was actually quite ambitious. It was one of the first examples of in situ concrete frame buildings, tall buildings in London. You can see the kind of cantilevered balconies in concrete here. There's a kind of optimism to that project, but a failed approach to the ground floor. And our building sort of mediates between the historic context and the contemporary. And then on our subsequent site, we actually went up a scale in terms of density. This is more a sort of traditional mansion block with 6 stories, and there's cores every 2 flats. And again, French doors, high ceilings, sheltered balconies, all of the things that we know from experience provide really high quality living space. And so this is how the plan works. It's a kind of ground scraper. You can see there's no corridor. There's a core with a stair and a lift, and then 3 flats arranged around the core. So the idea is that people can meet their neighbor, and there's only 3 people, and you don't have to walk down a corridor. Very high ceilings, 3-meter high ceilings on the top floor, and recessed balconies that create that outdoor room. And then we have some other housing projects sort of on the go. This project was inspired by the eagle pencil, or the barrel pencil, you might know. It's on the site of the Barrel Factory in London. So it's in North London, Tottenham Hale, and there was a big pencil factory where the site is now. And so that's our site, and this is the sort of former context. And this is just a very quick summary of a kind of, well, it was also a competition, this project, a sort of 2-week competition where we were given a site, a kind of massing envelope. The Victoria line, the tube line, runs straight under the building, so the volume had to be cut in 2. And then there's mains and sewers slicing off another piece. And then we had to get light into the site and open it up to this cultural education building behind us, and then connecting it to its sort of context and rationalizing the geometry. And this is the final form. And so these kind of exercises, we sort of simplify them, but in principle, it's how we have to work around both the constraints of the site and the unusual geometries of the site. But then in a way, the idea of the building to have a sort of rough, textured skin, which is brick, orange brick, and then a silvery reflective internal courtyard is, in a way, that idea of the pencil with a skin, a contrasting skin to its internal mass. And so we work very hard. These are sort of drawings that we do for planning. You know, it just goes in to get planning consent. It's nowhere near tendering or construction, but you have to sort of guarantee the quality that you want in the final product right at sort of rezoning planning stage. And then this is all sort of leading up to my biggest project, I suppose, which is in the Greenwich Peninsula in London, which was formerly just marshland and a power station. And, oops, this is a bit out of order. This is in Cambridge, actually, northwest Cambridge. But this is the biggest project in London, which is in the Greenwich Peninsula. And here we were trying, it was a super high density site, 600 dwellings per hectare, 4 buildings on a single plot. And here we were trying to evoke the spirit of the Victorian sort of engineering around the power station and create a sort of lattice and a continuous loggia across the front of all of the buildings to create that filtered space. And here are some models that we produced. And in a way, this image sort of expresses the language, a sort of lexicon of housing typologies. And you can see the geometries that we work with have a lot to do with either responding to and mediating the context, which in London is usually very organic in its geometry, but sometimes we work with very sort of pure ideas. For example, this scheme, which is in Cambridge, where they're very much like palazzos. We're developing a sort of palazzo typology as opposed to a bar or a mansion block typology. And I'll just diverge a bit to talk about the smile. This is basically showing the portfolio, in a way, of work that led up to my 21-year party last year, an anniversary and publication of a book. But the smile was obviously a really fantastic project for us in terms of really, in a way, responding to a brief, which was to just design anything, like a public building that would somehow celebrate design in London using 72 cubic meters of tulip wood. That was the brief. So it was 2 container loads of tulip wood, which was being donated by the American Hardwood Export Council. So this project, I really wanted to kind of make timber do something it had never done before, which is cantilever. That's a huge cantilever, the longest that's ever been done in timber. It's 14 meters on either side of the center point. And to create a kind of pavilion that doesn't really look like architecture, but that would attract people to experience it as architecture. And so it was a very immersive installation when you went inside. It was obviously a very focusing experience. One end of the sort of curved tunnel, I suppose, focused on the Edwardian architecture of Chelsea College of Art, and the other end focused on a very beautiful tree. And we worked very hard with our engineers, Arup, to make this happen. We perforated it on the ends to allow sort of expression of the structural forces, because they're the least in this area. So each hole was very precisely located. And there's a cradle under there with 20 tons of lead weights, because we couldn't dig foundations. There's an archaeological site under this arc, and so we had to use a counterweight system. And then at night, it's I suppose this image is the closest to what was my first intention for the project, was that it would feel like an infinite space. So when you're standing at the top of the arc, you can't see where it ends. So it actually takes you into sort of another dimension. But it's made of 12 huge panels of cross-laminated tulip wood. And it was a kind of incredibly popular thing. It got photographed about 1 million times on Instagram. Everybody really had fun with the photography, and it was a really well-loved installation in London, and also a very important experiment in terms of timber engineering. So, and then finally the Cohen Quad in Oxford, which I sort of wanted to celebrate this with my 21-year party, because it was actually at this point, when it was finished, that we decided to stage a major exhibition at Somerset House, my favorite building in London. And this is the Embankment Gallery space. And we made a video, a film of the practice's work, and staged our models throughout the space. This is Somerset House. This is not my party. It would have it would have been nice. Maybe next time, 30-year party will look like that. But Somerset House just has this amazing capacity to take on cultural events of every type. And one of the most interesting things is that downstairs, it's got 2 levels of basement that you can sort of see into from here up in the air. And now the Courtauld Institute has Makerversity there. So it's a university studio spaces for makers. So there's all sorts of production happening in the basement levels of Somerset House. So yeah, here's some more images so we showed all our process models and our sort of final model in the spirit of Christopher Wren of our Cohen Quad in Oxford, and models of this project, which is nearly finished, in Belsize Park in London, which again is another experiment in geometry, planar geometry, and meshing and bay windows, having to sort of respond to this kind of architecture and get planning consent in London, which is very difficult. So my 21-year anniversary gave me the incentive also to publish a book, Ideals and Ideas, where I felt it was really important to state the kind of values behind my work, and there's an essay in there where I describe these 4 ideals as authenticity, generosity, civicness, and beauty. And I really felt it's important that I actually use the word beauty, which is also something that's been sort of rejected since the early modern movement, sort of discussions of aesthetics and what constitutes beauty. But beauty is generally what everybody wants in their life, as well as civicness and generosity and authenticity. And so this kind of declaration of a value system, I felt, was important in starting a discussion, and also to kind of change the perspective of clients. And in a way, society at large doesn't expect this from architects, and I think it's important we reclaim this territory. And in the book, I sort of described my work according to these themes, these sort of techniques or tactics or themes that actually have influenced all of my work. But I've actually decided to talk about this word models and name this talk model building, because I think the word models is in a way more instrumental than the word ideals. I'm really interested in language and the way we articulate architectural ideas with words. And we use the word model a lot, but we use it very loosely and in many different ways that I think a lot of people don't relate to outside of the profession. And so how do we combine this idea of ideals and models? What does it mean? And of course, there's one way of using the word models, which is building models, typological models, theoretical models, conceptual, institutional, and urban. And we all sort of know what we mean by those, that they're sort of exemplar and they're sort of ideal. And also, but in the other way, we can express the word model, even in a way emphasizing that quality that applies not only to objects such as houses, but also people. So model family, model community, model organization. And in a way, this idea of model society, I think, is what we're, in a way, like the expectation is that someday we will achieve a model society, but what is that model society, and how does architecture contribute to that and allow many different kinds of models and model scenarios to exist and to coexist? So this idea of model building, I felt, was really important to discuss and sort of articulate in the context of my project in Oxford, which was a competition I won in 2011 for the new Cohen Quad in Oxford. And this is a kind of model community. Oxford colleges, I'm not sure if they're exactly the same here at Harvard, but Oxford is made up of colleges, which are actual communities. They are autonomous, independent communities. And not only is Oxford its sort of pedagogical model based on colleges, but its architectural model and morphology is based on colleges, which are quadrangles. And so each one of these quads represents a college, and that college is a community made of fellows and students who and staff who live and teach and learn in the quad. And this model comes from the monastic tradition. They were started as monasteries that then became secular and now form the kind of college model that we all know and love. And so when I was shortlisted for this competition, of course, I did a lot of research into the history of Exeter College, its quads, and the amazing kind of roof line and amalgamation of different periods and styles of architecture, but framing a collective space, and the very thin buildings that were accessed by stairs, one stair per sort of community in a way, serving two rooms. And Exeter College is this bit right here. So it's an amazing 700-year-old campus with beautiful neo-Gothic chapel and gardens, Fellows Gardens, front quad, back quad. And then all of these are other colleges, Jesus College, John's College, Trinity College, etc. And this typology always is about framing a space, a sort of collective outdoor space, and the nature of Exeter College in Turl Street is very much about these framing spaces, but then jewel buildings, this incredible jewel building in which is 1865, George Gilbert Scott, basically one of the most beautiful examples of neo-Gothic architecture in the UK. And this kind of legacy is something that you have to sort of take on board when you work for an Oxford college. So when we won the competition, the idea was that it would be finished for their 700-year anniversary, which was in 2014, which was going to be difficult since that was 2011, so we only had 4 years. But, and this is the site up here in the top left-hand corner. So basically all of the land in central Oxford is gone, it's taken, and this one site came up, which was the site of a former Ruskin College, and all of the colleges were bidding for it, but Exeter College got it, which was very lucky. And we were given a project brief. And really the project brief was to reinvent the collegiate ideal for the 21st century. That was the kind of summary statement. And you can see it includes many, many different kinds of uses: living and study spaces, study bedrooms, fellows studies, fellows sets where they teach, large seminar rooms, small seminar rooms, auditorium, learning commons, archive, common rooms, cafe, kitchens, offices, courtyards, porter's lodge, sort of everything. It's like a sort of campus in a building. And this site was, there was a historic building at the front of the site, which was the former Ruskin College. And this kind of legacy is sort of something you always come up against in the UK. Ruskin College, well, the building was named after John Ruskin, and John Ruskin was a tutor of William Morris, and William Morris is an alumnus of Exeter College. And so the kind of interconnectedness of great cultural figures and philosophers is very deep. And also Ruskin College was a working man's college where some of the first sort of social justice movements happened in the UK. So although the idea or the project was to tear down the building in its entirety, this sort of historic building and a bunch of accretions along the back, we had to retain the facade of the existing building. But all of this was basically, unusable legacy. And this was the set of diagrams that we produced at the sort of second stage of or actually the first stage of the competition, where you had to put your concepts on one A4 page, a sort of approach. And we did some very simple section diagrams in this series of sort of figure ground plans to illustrate in a way, our capacity to consider many, many different typologies in terms of how we approached the site for the next stage. And what we ended up doing is something like this, which is this was what was there on the site, more or less existing. And we sort of took that diagram and rotated it in the middle and sort of created an entirely new space at the middle of the building, and it became what we called the S-shaped quad. So this gesture actually sort of transformed the potential of the site to have one garden quad facing south, another one facing north, and this space in the middle of the project became something that wasn't even in the competition brief. That became central to the project. And so I think there's a series of slides here. Well, anyway, the site plan became this S, and you can see this south-facing courtyard and a north-facing courtyard, and then this sort of transitional piece in the middle. And what this meant was we could create this space, which we call the Learning Commons, which is the social learning space and the heart of the building. So the sort of entrance, the idea of the journey that you would enter the building through a historic facade, go into a 21st century context and be led in a route through to this learning space and to a sort of jewel building at the end of the journey. It was also a three-dimensional concept because the site slopes, so this would be a multi-level space, and it would form part of what we called a continuous three-dimensional ambulatory. And so to develop this idea of a route and a narrative, obviously passages and corridors are important, and we try never to have corridors. We try to make all spaces into habitable places. And so this concept for the cloisters, which are the passages through the building, were based on the idea of a convex ellipse. So these series of timber ribs form and describe the space of a convex ellipse, so we could create space to dwell at the center. And then a second cloister, which is made in concrete, and that forms the space of a concave ellipse. And so these two cloisters connect the ends of the building and lead to the central learning commons space and connect to the auditorium at the end. And this was our competition image, starting to sort of describe the materials we hope to use. And here you can see the sort of final plan, so the idea of the entrance, the journey past the teaching rooms, an amphitheater, the learning commons in the middle, another set of teaching rooms, cloister, and auditorium. And this kind of continuity between inside and outside and this kind of central space in the building was its driving sort of plan organization. And then this is an image sort of while we were modeling in the competition stage, the idea of actually making the roof of a single sheet of metal, which is cut and folded and sort of tailored to a series of stepped volumes that allow the building to respond to the scale of the street from the institutional down to the domestic. And so these folded wrapping planes actually do two things. They express the new sort of community of students in the building, and they allowed us to really add another 2 stories onto the building, disguised by this sort of mansard roof, and to create new kinds of spaces under those curved roofs. So it was a kind of tailoring of curved planes to fit the building, and you get these sort of automatic, interesting dormer windows that cut through those curved planes. And so the building is like a 6/7-story building that reads as a 3-story building. These floors are the sort of the sort of workhorse of the building are the student room floors with family kitchens, windows at the end of the corridors so that no space feels like a corridor, teaching rooms on the top floor, and lots and lots of different activities and functions throughout the building. And in a way, the expressive capacity of this project is really symbolized by the roof, and we wanted to, in a way, refer to the arts and crafts tradition of Jericho, the neighborhood, the sort of medieval neo-Gothic patterning of the chapel. And we were inspired by this leadwork on the spire of the chapel, and that became our sort of point of reference in terms of the iconography of the project and the expression of the roof. So the metal, it's actually stainless steel shingles, and I'll talk about them more in a minute. And so this is how it sort of all comes together in a very simple diagram: the retained facade, the kind of stone plinth, the timber cloisters, the student rooms, and then the all-enveloping roof. 2 years of planning, consultations. We had to write a book. This is a book called The History of the Evolution of Roofs in Oxford, and we had to do that to convince the planners that our curved roof had a kind of lineage within the sort of tradition of Oxford from the 11th century Norman cathedrals to contemporary times. And this is a list of the stakeholder consultations. You can see they went over a 3-year period: 2011, 2014 consent. And then this is a kind of whiz through the construction sequence. So piling, retained facade, concrete frame going up, and the steel frame for the roofs, the glue lamps for the auditorium being erected. And then these columns actually hold the beams, so it's a column-free space. And that's the auditorium under construction, the cloister. The stainless steel shingles were actually made in Enfield, in the last metal workshop left in London, where they oxidize stainless steel. And so we had to achieve a very special pattern that prevented too much reflection. And so we made one-to-one mock-ups of different scales and sizes of shingles to ensure that they didn't heat up the neighborhood, because some people were complaining to the college that these stainless steel roof tiles would actually change the climate in Jericho. And so we had to prove to them that that wouldn't happen. But another important thing about this project, and in a way the roof, and using these shingles, was to use metal craftspeople to actually make the building in the spirit of William Morris and the arts and crafts. And they were amazing. The the team that put the roof shingles on. There are so many of them, and it really is a skill and an art, and something we wanted to celebrate. So this is how the building appears. It's very subtle. You don't notice it if you don't look up when you're walking down the street, but this is our sort of two-story extension to the roof of this sort of Edwardian Baroque facade, behind which is sort of concealed a series of volumes. This is obviously still under construction. And in a way, the experience, the surprise of going through that historic facade and coming into the building was something that is in a way a part of the story of the college and of the site that we think is valuable. So this is the Porter's Lodge. So in that entry hall space, you are drawn into the south cloister, and you can see the south quad, staircase on the left, pigeonholes made of brass. My little tribute to Donald Judd, if he ever made a pigeonholes wall for a college, I thought that's how that might happen. So the idea is to invite students to use the stairs by making them warm and friendly places. All of the signage and handrails are in brass. These emulate a book with its leaves open. And the south cloister has, it's glazed, and so it has a sort of constantly changing quality of light throughout the day, depending on, and the leaves moving. And then the north cloister is concrete, so it has a completely different quality. It faces north, completely different light. And between the cloister arches, you can see into study rooms. And then some of the big seminar rooms are behind the retained facade, and they reflect, well, these are retained historic windows. But then other spaces are entirely contemporary. This is the Learning Commons. So in this social learning space, Oxford's first social learning space, you can be in enclosed rooms, lower mezzanines that are semi-open. You can go down to the cafe, so that you can see the street beyond, so you're kind of connected to the context. And then looking in the other direction, this is the South Quad and Worcester College beyond, cafe down below, quiet sitting area. So the whole space is very fluid and very open, and students kind of study in the cafe or wherever they feel comfortable throughout the Learning Commons. It's used also for parties and club nights down here, and then all of our corridors are study areas. And this is the North Quad, so in the internal rooms you can see through the quad into the courtyard. And this is the foyer, the box office for the auditorium, and here's William Morris rug, so this is part of the college's collection. It's the only 4-meter by 4-meter wall in the whole building, and it fit exactly the William Morris rug, which is a very nice coincidence. And then this is the auditorium roof kind of emerging. And it was, the idea here is to pull the light from the south sort of across the roof and down and into the space of the auditorium, because this is on the north side of the building. So these plates actually connect the sort of wishbone columns to the roof. These were made in the Netherlands. And this is the auditorium. The staircases, so going up the stairs you can see into courtyards, or you can see into the Learning Commons. All of the wood is cherry. It's a kind of personal obsession I have. I love cherry wood, and it takes me back to North America, American cherry. I think it's a kind of quintessential wood. And these are the corridors up on the student floors. So, and back down in the cafe again, the archive, and these are stained glass windows that we put into the corridor adjacent to the archive, and they're William Morris stained glass windows. These are family kitchens on every floor for the students to study. These are student rooms that are under the curved roof, so exposed concrete walls and big curved ceilings if you're lucky enough to get one of those rooms. I don't know what's happened here. I'll keep going. That's a fellows study. So these are the teaching sets up on the 3rd floor where professors have their permanent studies and they teach students in little groups of 4 or 5. And this is a study facing Worcester College. So this project, I think, in a way is a culmination of a lot of the, in a way, the aspirations that any architect would want to deliver for a client, a sort of long-term client who wants to invest in a future community and a kind of architectural typology that supports that community. And actually, this brings sort of new expression to Oxford, to its roof line. It's not about spires and sort of ecclesiastical architecture. It's about a community and a kind of embracing language of form and material that is, in a way, has opened up a lot of new possibilities in Oxford. Apparently, there are quite a lot of new projects that are happening that have curved roofs, which haven't really been done since Wren did the Sheldonian. And so it's been a sort of really satisfying process. It's about to be launched to the public in a few months. These things do take a long time to open, and this is our sort of piece of Oxford quad that's open on 2 sides rather than enclosed. Now, I have another project that is, in a way, I'm just going to whiz through till I get to the Biennale, because in a way the culmination of this talk is talking about the Venice Architecture Biennale. And it actually, my installation there sort of includes and incorporates elements from Exeter College and from my residential projects. And King's Cross is a really important project in London because it's one of its biggest regeneration sites and one of its most important. And so we won a competition for this site here up at the top of the main axial park. This is King's Cross. And this is the canal that runs through it. It's former rail lands, University of the Arts, and this is the central park. Thomas Heatherwick's doing this piece here, and lots of other architects are doing interesting parts around the master plan. And it's one of the best examples of landscape, a really great public realm and landscape design in London. This huge amphitheater going down to the canal. That's Central St. Martin's. This is a new building that's just a pub. It's just been built as a pub and nothing else, which is incredible. And in our project, I really wanted to sort of draw on the spirit of King's Cross and its sort of landmark historic buildings like King's Cross Station itself, and the tradition of really fantastic expressive arches that express the technology of railway sheds at the turn of the century. And so we had another sort of very awkward site with 5 sides, with tube lines running underneath it, that we had to sort of carve and excavate to create a courtyard building. And in a way, this project is another example of sort of working with the geometry and with the language of sort of diversity of height and scale, and sort of creating our own skyline and bringing it all together with a continuous colonnade, arched colonnade at its base. And most projects in London, and King's Cross in particular, embed a lot of different uses at the ground floor, lots of entrances. It's all about mixing it up. This is our ground floor plan, very, very tight plan. Reflecting pond at the center, and different commercial and office workspaces around the perimeter. And we spend a lot of time making our plans work very hard. It's very difficult to get the efficiency, and the, all of the flats have to be minimum sizes, but we really push for volume and ceiling height. And this image is from our competition scheme, so very sort of slender totem at the top of the park, and it's all about bringing sort of a building with no front and no back, that it acts as a threshold that invites people to actually move around its space and use its spaces in different ways. Some of these are office spaces. And it actually has different readings. Also, it has a small public square to the northwest, so the volumes kind of modify as it rotates around. And so this project, in a way, it's also been a very highly technical project in terms of working out the language and tectonics of arches, which is something we've lost, I think, in the last 100 years. We haven't done arches much, and so we're, as good modernists, so we're sort of learning. We've tested many different kinds. Sorry, this has all gone really moiré. Our sort of tests of brick, voussoirs, and Bezier arches, and getting the geometries to work. And our arches actually are all different sizes because they're actually expressing the structure. Obviously, columns are coming down here, and so our arches are actually on an in situ concrete frame, as all buildings have been since the mid-19th century, but actually have articulated arches. And so these are sort of exploratory renders. It has gone in for planning. It's imminent that it goes in for planning. This is the courtyard space. And probably this project is the closest I've been to trying to evoke the spirit of, in a way, Rome and Hadrian's Villa and some of the major influences that I had as a student in Rome, because Waterloo students spend their 4th year in Rome. So this is the sort of crown of the building. And this project and our other ones are the sort of the main protagonists of our installation for the Venice Biennale. So we were invited last autumn by Grafton Architects to participate in the Free Space Venice Biennale, which is on at the moment until the end of November. And this is a kind of funny image. It's a sort of reverse image of the Corderia in Venice and the space that we were allocated, which is here in the first room, and our sort of installation, how it ended up appearing there. But it was kind of a two-stage process. The Graftons first again asked us to put on a single A4 page what our concept for installation would be. And so this was our concept, to create a plinth from which 4 totems emerge, and each one of these totems or spaces or columns that show in section here represent a different quality of free space in housing. They asked me to actually address the subject of housing somehow within the theme of free space. And so the idea was that each one of these columns or totems would create an experience of free space. But we hadn't really decided how we were going to do this at this point. It was all very quick. And so that concept of a sort of plinth with 4 totems, each representing a different quality, became articulated in our final proposal, which we called recasting, where we recast 4 qualities of free space in our housing as very particular elements, creating an immersive experience. And so, in a way, the arches from the King's Cross projects were abstracted as an arch representing threshold. This space represents a roof space that we often work with dormers and roofs and faceted geometries to create very particular spatial qualities in roofs. This is actually the cloister from the Cohen Quad turned on its end and recreated at about 1/10 scale. So you lie down in here and you look up and you get an illusion of the cloisters from the Cohen Quad. And this is a sort of replica of our Accordia project. It's the quality is inhabited edges and the way we manipulate geometry to make the edges of buildings places to inhabit. And the central space reflects a kind of civic space, a gathering space that the amphitheater feeds. So this was our sort of first render. The idea was to make everything out of plywood, and which actually creates certain limitations in terms of how you build it. But one of the most interesting processes was how to create this arch, our sort of Bezier arch, and to dematerialize something that you would expect to be very solid, which is an arch. And these are the sort of renders we did of the experiences of the four totems. So the threshold totem with mirrors on each side of its internal arch creates an infinite colonnade. The roof space totem with angled mirrors and sloped walls and a bench creates an infinite crescent of roof space. And this is the image of the cloister that you see. There's a mirror at the end at a very slight angle, so you get this sort of doubled impression of the cloister. And this is looking up into the inhabited edges totem that, in a way, echoes our Accordia project. So this was these are pictures taken at the Biennale. It's a very long image on the wall of the Corderia and all of the architects working there, some of whom teach here at the GSD. And we were very happy to be here, right at the front. And the next image is actually a video where I will take you through, it's sort of the last image, the process of making recasting, where we've, in a way, made an ideal model of the models that we build in our architecture. I should say that my project architect, who I worked with on recasting and who made this video and built the project, is Kerry Edmonds, who actually is a GSD graduate. Some of you might remember him. He's been working with me for a long time. This is the studios of Benchmark, who have their workshop outside of Oxford, and they're the most incredible craftsmen ever. They 3D modeled every little piece, even from our 3D model. They modeled every element of the project and also designed its packing and its shipping and the components, and they were amazing. And all of the material was donated by a Spanish plywood company. It'll come to me in a minute. This was really tricky for installing these pieces. They were very big, and the connections, all the connecting pieces, were really hard to get at, and we had to disguise everything and conceal all the connections. And you can see the double layer of arch. That second set of shims in the arch is actually the structure that's preventing the thrust from actually making the arch collapse. So there's an inner arch and an outer arch. So I suppose this is also quite a contextual project because we designed it so that it would culminate in that window of the Corderia. It isn't a coincidence that the window's at the top of the amphitheater. And we also wanted it to act as a stage and a resting place for people going through the Biennale and for people to sort of watch the adjacent exhibition, because there was a video installation next door. So it was really meant to be a place where people could sort of hang out and spend time and act as that sort of framed, shared stage for a kind of simulacrum of civic life. The plywood, the manufacturer is called Garnica. I knew it was going to come to me. And it's poplar plywood, so it's super lightweight and it grows very fast, so it's really, really sustainable. And one of the reasons we could use it is because of its lightweight, because there are strict weight requirements in the Biennale. You get a bit of a surprise when you walk in in all of them. There's a surprise in all of the totems. So I'm going to end on these photos. I really like these because it's a really good sign when children and babies like your architecture. And this was really, really fun to see these kids enjoying recasting. And then the kind of final stamp of approval came from Peter Cook and Yael Cook enjoying the roof space totem. Thanks very much. Thank you.
So I think first of all, thank you, Alison, for a wonderful lecture. I think we only have time for a couple of questions. But if they're yes or no questions, we could take more. I think someone will bring the mic to you.
Hi, thank you very much. What have been some of your most fruitful collaborations with engineers, and what characterizes them?
We really enjoyed working with Arup. When you work with specialist teams, you kind of get extra enthusiasm, like the Andrew Lawrence, who runs the timber group at Arup, is just so passionate about timber engineering, and he knows everything about it. And that's been really, really successful. We work with a lot of different engineers, but I would say the best experiences are when they actually come up with ideas during meetings, rather than sort of waiting for the design to be finished. There's a kind of condition in practice where consultants say, don't contact us until the project is frozen, the design is frozen, then we'll do our engineering. And that's really frustrating because you want more of a dialogue during the process. I mean, I've worked with one engineer, David Akira, for most of my house projects, and he's just amazing because he makes impossible things happen. I've used a lot of steel in the houses I've done, as well as timber. They're normally hybrid projects. But it's really, I mean, for this project and the Smile, it was just really, really hard, both of those projects, both for the engineers and just the logistics of the whole thing, and it had to happen so quickly. But that idea of having the second arch ring, which it acts as spacers, but it also stops the arch, the forces from exploding outwards. That was a really nice thing that happened. That was, it was purely the engineer who said that. We were just kept hoping that all of the compression forces would be taken up in the inner arch and that would be fine. And then it was impossible because we had nothing around it. So I don't know, there has to be a kind of openness and a willingness to just try things that just seem impossible when you first start. No other questions?
I'll ask a question. Well, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the model. The model as an exemplar. I mean, I think the work is incredible, and you talked about every project being bespoke and very specific, site and context specific. But over the years, there are also certain tenets that begins to continue through the projects. And I'm also wondering if in the urban scale, a lot of your projects are in London or the UK, but now you're working in Canada, now you're working in Moscow. Are there certain things that begins to carry over? I think of the model in the Cacciamere di Kinsey sense, the model where everything comes through. And there's some moments where I could begin to detect that, and even like in the Venice Biennale installation, like when you talk about the passage, the roofscape, the threshold. I wonder if these kind of architectural moments are the equivalent to the urban artifact for you, that are your language that begins to transcend the specific context of your projects or locales.
Yeah, I think there are certain devices, I suppose, like architectural devices, that I think are sort of essential in conveying, I suppose, these ideals of generosity, for example, of civicness, of authenticity, all of these things. I mean, authenticity is a little bit too general a word. I think in terms of generosity, the free space theme of this year's Biennale was really appropriate, because it's something that I fight for in all of my projects, especially in housing. You have to really work very hard to build in generosity. You have to kind of sneak it into projects, really. And those are the places that people love the most, those places that are just a little bit unexpected and out of the ordinary. And I suppose there's sort of ideas of sometimes I call it plasticity, that if you work with architectural matter in a subtractive way rather than additive, you kind of embed those spatial and formal qualities in your architecture in a way that's more permanent and more legible than sort of adding things in layers. I think you know what I mean. It's sort of, I mean, your work, I think, does similar things in that you kind of work with the fundamental body of the building, and it takes a sort of commitment, like in terms of geometry and the sort of effects that you produce. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but there are definitely recurring themes, and I think every project in a way has to serve as a model, like a kind of model project. Sometimes I say, like, you have to treat every project like it's your last. You know, it has to be like the absolute best possible thing, because it might be the last building you do. So I don't sort of, I don't have projects that are sort of like backroom projects and then A-list project. Every project has to be an A-list project. So, and I think that investment is worth it. Like, maybe it means, well, I think I deliberately haven't grown as a practice when I could have become bigger than like 30 or 40, because I just, I turned down projects that where I don't think there's an opportunity to be able to stand by my values. And so, yeah, I suppose that capacity for architects to say no to clients who aren't also sharing your value system is really important. And I think it's the only way that we're going to shift the ground, you know, shift in a way how we are perceived in terms of our value, our cultural value, and our political value, and our social value. It's all about our work and in a way the model scenarios we create with our work.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much. This is the work is mesmerizing. The question I have, I'm sure you're familiar with the tiny homes movement. So that's, you know, where you have about 20 square meters or so to work with. How would your ideas apply in that sort of miniature context, or do you have to evolve your ideas or change them in some way? And have you, second part of that, have you had to design something like that? Thank you.
Thank you. I've kind of avoided those projects, to be honest. I just think it's very difficult to work on sort of micro accommodation that isn't a sort of, and this is going to sound quite tough. It's very easily commoditized. You know, it's a kind of stepping stone to your real, your sort of real home or your real life. And I kind of feel like a lot of things that are like, they're called products, you know, that are being put out on the market. I really hate that term. Housing, places where people live as products. I think that our energy should be going into creating places where people can move and live their life in that place and not have to move, you know, 3 or 4 times every time you have to scale up. And if more energy was devoted to building actually the sort of the kinds of dwellings, like whether they're they can still be apartments and flats and multi-story and high density, but they should be places where people feel they can, you know, have a social life and live for years and have things. And I know there's a kind of changing scenario where, you know, co-living and all of that stuff, where you have a sort of tiny flat, and then you share living and eating and leisure spaces. And I think there's a place for that, but I mean, you need lots and lots of different solutions. But I think it's, you know, building is such a complex and expensive process, and that the energy that we have to put into making urban buildings, making homes, making those things, I think we have to go for more generosity and more space. I've never really known anybody to say, like, I've got too much space. Nobody ever says that.
So maybe we'll take the last question.
I'm wondering, with architectural sites, so you have the idea of the model, which sort of exists in a pristine state. Do you ever have the desire to or the ability to go back and see sort of what happens to these designs that have become actual buildings and lived in, whether they become deteriorated or just people decorate them differently? Do you have a desire to do that, or do you ever do that?
Yeah, I do that a lot. Actually, all of my projects that I've built, I tend to, like, you have to make an effort as an architect. After you build housing in particular, you have to leaflet the building. Like when we submitted Ely Court for various awards, because there's dozens of awards that you can submit your projects for, we send a letter, like we hand deliver a letter to everybody in the building and say, you know, we are your architects. We hope you enjoy your home. We would like to take people on tours of the building, such as RIBA juries and various awards bodies. Would you like your home to be one of the places on the tour? And we always get, you know, 3 or 4 people who say, sure, I'd love my home to be part of your tour. And so then we go and meet them, and we get to know them, and then, you know, we have to make arrangements with them every time we take a jury panel, like the Mies van der Rohe Award panel, or the RBA Awards, or the Housing Design Awards. You always have to take juries in the building. Like, those awards, they don't accept photographs. Like, you have to, there's about 12 architects on the jury, and they go around and examine everything and interview the residents. So you can't hide anything. And it's, I mean, all my projects, New Hall, Accordia, Ely Court, they're all happy residents. I mean, sometimes people have complaints, sometimes bits of their house or something goes wrong, but of course that's generally a contractor thing. Design and build. But all of the projects, I mean, seriously, they are really well loved by the residents. And actually, Ely Court, all those projects in South Kilburn, they're about 5 minutes walk from my house. So it's actually my neighborhood. So I can't not do a really good job because it's my patch. And there's something really kind of amazing about actually working in your own neighborhood, sort of doing urban design and residential urban architecture. Like, you're making a piece of the city that you live in. That's a kind of, you know, it's public space, it's civics. I actually say housing is civic building because it creates the space of the street, it creates public space, it frames it, and the facade of a building is public realm, just as the ground plane is public realm. And so we have a kind of responsibility and a duty to make that civic space as high quality as possible. And if you think of housing in those terms as civic building, suddenly your expectation goes way up, and you think of it as an important piece of, you know, the future of the city. You know, it's future heritage, sometimes I call it.
Thanks.
Thank you again for a good lecture. Thanks.
Okay.